Let's talk about gossip, specifically how gossip can spread through history to create a false narrative of someone's life. Over time, as facts become obscured by myths and rumors, you can create a whole life that didn't happen to hide the truth of a widow who built an unusual house because she had a hobby and plenty of money. Let's talk about the Winchester Mystery House. The story of the Winchester Mystery House is well known to just about everyone. The myths about a superstitious woman constantly adding on to her house to evade vengeful spirits has been lauded as creepy by even the likes of Stephen King. And in fact, it is interesting to think of a ghost story where the main character can stave off death as long as she meets the demands of the spirits. But how much fact is there to the story? Did Sarah Winchester really act on the advice of a psychic? Or has history created a caricature of a woman who just kept to herself? Let's examine the story and find out the truth. To do this most effectively, let's look at the individual parts of the story and see how they line up with recorded history, including Sarah Winchester's own journals. First, the claim that Sarah was motivated to consult a psychic after her husband and daughter died within months of each other. This is an easy rumor to discredit, as records show that Sarah's daughter died in infancy of marasmus in 1866, while her husband didn't die until 14 years later in 1881 from tuberculosis. Neither death was mysterious. She did also suffer from the deaths of other family members, including her mother and father-in-law. So, given that, we're left with a rich widow who, rather than moving out of superstition, moved west with the intent of settling in an area she and her late husband loved and building a house big enough that her whole family could live together. This is, of course, contrary to claims that nobody knows why she built her house, or that it was the advice of a psychic. This didn't last long, as she originally moved west with two of her sisters and their families, but because they settled in other areas, they were unable to live with Sarah, and she decided to build a big house anyway. The next part of the legend claims that Sarah did construction on the house constantly and at random to confuse ghosts, but the explanation for the house's odd design is much more down to earth. For one, the construction on the house did begin immediately, but it was not constant. Sarah would send workers home, sometimes for months at a time, when she felt like it. She makes mention of this in her own journals. Not being a trained architect, Sarah did not use blueprints for her designs, but ordered construction as she felt like it. This resulted in some beautiful architecture, but a layout that was impractical and confusing, requiring workers to have maps so as not to get lost. This also accounts for the stairway that leads nowhere, doors opening to walls, and windows that look into other rooms. An attempt to confuse ghosts makes for a spooky detail of a story, but the whims of a rich woman are closer to the truth. What about the psychic who gave her advice? It turns out he probably didn't exist either. After checking a few sources, it became clear that nobody had been able to find record that this psychic was real and not the fabrication of various gossips. Even though it could be tempting to say she might have consulted a psychic given the rise of spiritualism, defenders and friends at the time claimed she was a very sensible and not superstitious woman. Indeed, nothing I have seen suggests that she would take the word of a psychic as anything worth following. So, while the stories surrounding Sarah Winchester make for great entertainment and have inspired many horror writers, it is important to keep the facts clear. Sarah Winchester, rather than a superstitious widow, was simply a rich woman with nothing but time on her hands and a passion for building on to her house. Construction was guided not by a fear of the dead, but by the whims of her vision for what her house might look like in the end. Indeed, we haven't really seen the full house, as a large part of it was destroyed in an earthquake, and Sarah just moved on. This doesn't mean we need to let the stories die, but keep them in the proper context as stories, and remember the full picture of an interesting figure in history.